This cancer is impossible. There is nothing more we can do. The Mayo Clinic conference room fell silent. Then, a black nurse in the back slowly raised her hand. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't supposed to speak. But what she said next would change modern medicine forever. Back-end index pointing right before this story unfolds. Subscribe, because stories like this remind us where miracles truly begin. The room at Mayo Clinic was designed to impress. High ceilings, soft lighting, screens glowing with charts and scans that only the sharpest minds in medicine could fully decipher. This was Grand Rounds, where the world's most respected oncologists gathered to decide what was possible and what was not. At the center of it all stood the lead physician. Calm, certain, untouchable. He spoke without hesitation. The cancer was rare, aggressive, relentless. It had defied every protocol, every trial, every drug thrown at it. This shouldn't even exist in this form, he said, tapping the screen. But it does, and it's terminal. A quiet murmur followed, not disagreement, but acceptance. The treatments had failed. The data was clear. The verdict final. The case, they said, was closed. Near the wall stood a nurse in dark blue scrubs. Her name was Leah Carter. No white coat, no microphone, no title badge that demanded attention. She held a tablet against her chest, eyes fixed on the images no one else was truly looking at anymore. Doctors didn't notice her. They rarely did. In rooms like this, nurses were expected to observe, not interrupt. To support, not challenge. To listen, not question the impossible. Leah had learned that lesson early in her career. She had learned how to stand still, how to be quiet, how to make herself small in places where confidence echoed louder than curiosity. But as the oncologist concluded, something unsettled her. It wasn't the diagnosis. It was what didn't fit. A pattern, a detail, a contradiction hidden between the lines of certainty. Her heart beat faster, not with fear, but with recognition. Still, she said nothing. Not yet, because in that room, the decision had already been made, and no one expected the nurse by the wall to have anything left to add. Leah Carter's story didn't begin at Mayo Clinic. It didn't begin under bright hospital lights or inside rooms where powerful voices decided who lived and who didn't. It began in a small, quiet apartment miles away from prestige and recognition. An apartment where the television stayed dark. Not because Leah didn't own one, but because she never turned it on. Instead, the glow came from her desk lamp. Stacks of medical journals replaced sitcoms. Patient charts replaced bedtime stories. While the world outside slept, Leah read, page after page, case after case, margin notes filling the spaces others skipped. She studied because she had learned, far too early, what happened when questions went unasked. Her mother had been sick for months. Not dramatic sickness. Not the kind that sends alarms ringing. Just subtle changes, fatigue that didn't make sense, pain that came and went, symptoms that didn't quite match the explanation she was given. Doctors said it was stress, then hormones, then age. By the time someone finally said the word cancer, it was already too late. Leah remembered the hospital room, the sound of machines, the way her mother squeezed her hand, apologizing, as if dying were something she had done wrong. The diagnosis came with shock, but also anger. Not because cancer existed, but because it hadn't been seen. Leah was still in nursing school when her mother passed away. At the funeral, people told her she was so strong, that she would make her mother proud. But what Leah felt wasn't strength. It was a vow. I will never stop asking questions, she whispered to herself that night. And she meant it. While others memorized just enough to pass exams, Leah went deeper. While classmates closed their books, she opened another one. While coworkers rested after long shifts, Leah pulled patient histories and searched for patterns hiding in plain sight. She learned something most people didn't talk about. Medicine wasn't just science. It was habit. Doctors followed protocols, and protocols saved lives. But sometimes they also created blind spots. When a case didn't fit neatly into known categories, it was easier to label it rare, unusual, or impossible than to question the framework itself. Leah questioned everything. She noticed how symptoms clustered differently in patients who didn't look like textbook examples. how pain presented itself in ways that weren't emphasized in lectures, how some patients were dismissed faster than others, not because their cases were simpler, but because their voices weren't heard as loudly. As a Black woman in healthcare, she saw that difference clearly. She saw patients who reminded her of her mother, nodding politely, trusting completely, unaware that something crucial was being missed. And she refused to let herself become numb. At Mayo Clinic, Leah was respected as a nurse, but respected quietly. She did her job with precision. She caught medication errors before they happened. She noticed when vital signs told a story no one else was listening to yet. She advocated for patients gently, carefully, knowing when to push and when pushing would cost her credibility. Still, she never stopped studying. In her locker sat notebooks filled with handwritten observations. In her bag, articles highlighted in multiple colors. In her mind, a constantly evolving map of what-ifs. She followed obscure case studies late into the night. Read about cancers that didn't behave like cancers. Tumors that mimicked one disease while being another entirely. Syndromes so rare they were often mistaken for anomalies or dismissed altogether. Leah didn't chase recognition. She chased understanding. So when the case at Grand Rounds was presented, the aggressive, rare, terminal cancer that had failed everything, her pulse quickened. Not because she doubted the doctor's intelligence, but because the story sounded familiar. Too familiar. She had seen cases where treatments failed not because the cancer was unbeatable, but because it had been misnamed, misclassified, misunderstood. She replayed the scans in her mind, the lab values, the timeline, the way symptoms progressed. Something didn't align. While the room accepted finality, Leah's instincts pushed back. This wasn't hope. It was pattern recognition, the kind you develop when you've spent years studying not just diseases but people. Leah stood there, quiet as ever. But inside her, the promise she made long ago stirred again. She hadn't become a nurse to stay silent when something felt wrong. She had become a nurse because once before, silence had cost her everything. And this time, she wasn't sure she could live with herself if she didn't speak. The room had already moved on. Slides advanced. Notes were taken. Pens scratched against paper with the quiet confidence of people who believed the hardest work had been done. At the front, the senior oncologist spoke again, not louder, just firmer. "This cancer does not respond," he said, eyes steady on the screen. "We've exhausted the literature. We've exhausted the options. Any alternative theory at this point is unrealistic." Unrealistic. The word landed gently in the room, but it struck Leah like a match to dry leaves. Heads nodded, not out of arrogance, but agreement. These were brilliant minds. Years of experience. Decades of cases. They had earned their certainty. And yet, Leah's chest tightened, because the data they were looking at told one story, and the data they were ignoring told another. She had gone back through the patient's chart the night before. Then again that morning. She traced the timeline, not the conclusions. She watched how the symptoms appeared, faded, then returned, not randomly, but rhythmically. There was a pattern. Subtle. Inconvenient. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The tumor markers fluctuated in a way that didn't match the diagnosis. The inflammation levels spiked after treatments that should have done nothing, or worse, caused uniform decline. But there was response. Not improvement. Response. Leah had seen this before in the margins of obscure case studies. Cancers mislabeled because they didn't behave the way they were supposed to. Conditions hiding beneath more familiar names. Diseases that wore disguises convincing enough to fool entire teams. She had underlined those papers late at night. She had written notes like, asterisk, what if it's not resistance? What if it's misidentification? Asterisk. Now, standing against the wall, those notes came rushing back. The doctor continued. "We are dealing with an anomaly," he said. "An outlier. Sometimes, medicine has to accept its limits." Accept its limits. The room absorbed the phrase like gospel. Leah felt her pulse in her ears, because what they were calling impossible felt dangerously close to what she had heard years ago in another hospital, in another room beside another bed. "We've done everything we can. That phrase had closed the door on her mother. She swallowed. Her mind raced, not with ego, but with consequence. She knew what raising her hand would mean. It would interrupt hierarchy. It would challenge authority. It would place her voice, a nurse's voice, into a space not designed to receive it. She also knew what staying silent would mean. Another chart closed. Another family given final words. Another chance quietly buried under certainty. Her fingers tightened around her tablet. For a moment, she hesitated, not because she doubted her observation, but because she understood the weight of being wrong in a room like this. Then the word echoed again in her mind. Impossible. It burned. Leah inhaled slowly, and then, before she could talk herself out of it, her hand rose. Not high, not dramatic, just enough to be seen. Softly, uninvited. The room didn't notice at first. The doctor continued speaking. Then someone in the front row turned. Then another. A pause rippled outward, subtle, confused. A nurse's hand was raised. The oncologist stopped mid-sentence. He looked toward the wall, toward the woman in dark scrubs. There was no challenge in her posture, no defiance in her expression. Just focus, just calm, just a question waiting to be asked. For the first time that morning, the room was truly silent. And in that silence, everything that had been declared impossible stood on the edge of being questioned. The silence didn't last long. The senior oncologist's brow tightened as his eyes settled on Leah. "A nurse," he said, the words not sharp, just dismissive. "This isn't appropriate." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone glanced down at their notes. The unspoken rule of the room reasserted itself. This wasn't how things were done. Leah felt the heat rise in her face. Not from embarrassment, from urgency. Because the moment she had raised her hand, she had already crossed the line that mattered. Going back into silence was no longer an option. "I understand," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the weight pressing against her chest. "But there's something in the data that hasn't been addressed." The doctor hesitated, a beat too long. Then, with visible restraint, he nodded once. Briefly, Leah stepped forward just enough to be heard. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't raise her voice. She explained. She pointed to a biomarker buried deep in the lab results, one that had been logged, then ignored because it didn't fit the assumed diagnosis. "This marker shouldn't fluctuate like that," she said, "unless we're not dealing with resistance, but misclassification." A few heads tilted. She moved to the next slide. The immune response. Everyone had noted the inflammation spikes, but they had dismissed them as collateral damage from aggressive treatment. Leah reframed them. "These spikes occurred after specific interventions," she said, tracing the timeline with her finger. "That suggests engagement. The immune system is reacting, not failing." The room grew quieter. Then she addressed the last point, the one she knew would be hardest to hear. "There's a treatment combination," Leah said, choosing her words carefully, "that has never been tested together because these two conditions aren't usually connected." A pause. "But if this isn't the cancer we think it is, then separating those treatments may be the reason nothing has worked." Not guesses, not hope, evidence. Printed, documented, cited. She referenced obscure studies, rare case reports, a small trial that had been dismissed years ago due to low enrollment. Articles most people in the room hadn't read, not because they weren't capable, but because they hadn't needed to. Until now. For a moment, no one spoke. The oncologist stared at the screen, then at Leah, then back at the data. The room, once filled with certainty, felt suddenly unfamiliar, like a map that no longer matched the terrain. Then the questions came. Not polite ones, not easy ones. What about toxicity? Why hasn't this been documented before? Are you suggesting we abandon protocol? Where did you find this study? What's the mechanism? What happens if you're wrong? Each question came fast, sharp, unfiltered, and Leah answered every single one. She didn't rush. She didn't dodge. She acknowledged risks where they existed. She clarified limits. She admitted uncertainty, but only where it was honest. When she didn't know something, she said so, and when she did, she backed it with facts. Her voice never wavered. Minutes passed, then more. People leaned forward. Pens stopped moving. Laptops closed. The oncologist asked one final question, the kind meant to end the conversation. If this were true, he said slowly, why hasn't anyone else seen it? Leah met his eyes. Because no one was looking for it, she said. And because nurses see patients longer than charts do. The words landed, not as an attack, as a truth. Something shifted. It wasn't applause. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. The hierarchy in the room didn't collapse, but it bent. The oncologist exhaled, long and measured. Pull the full data set, he said to the team. Rerun the analysis. He paused. And include her. In that moment, the room changed. Not because a nurse spoke, but because someone listened. The approval didn't come with celebration. It came with caution. Signatures were added slowly. Language was careful. The decision was framed as an exception, not a victory. The new treatment plan moved forward, not with confidence, but with quiet reluctance. Monitors were adjusted. Protocols rewritten. Every step documented as if history itself were watching. Leah didn't celebrate either. She waited, because she knew something medicine rarely talked about. Proof takes time. The first weeks passed with no headlines. No miracles. Just subtle shifts that only those watching closely would notice. Lab values softened. Inflammation markers fell into unfamiliar patterns. The patient slept better, ate more, laughed cautiously, as if afraid to trust the change. Then came the scans. They were reviewed once. Then again, the tumor had shrunk. Not dramatically, not magically, but undeniably. The room filled with silence, the kind that carries weight. Weeks later, another scan. The tumor had stabilized. No progression, no spread. Protocols that had once promised nothing now held possibility. And then came the scan no one expected. The room was crowded this time. Screens glowed. Breath was held. The image loaded. The mask that had once defined the patient's future was gone. No shadow, no outline, no trace. Doctors leaned closer, searching for error, rechecking angles, comparing timestamps. Disbelief settled in slowly. The impossible had failed. What had been declared terminal had retreated. What had been dismissed had responded. What had been unrealistic had rewritten the ending. No one spoke at first. Then someone whispered, "We need to document this." Leah stood near the back of the room again. Same dark scrubs, same quiet presence. But this time people noticed. They asked her questions, not defensively, but openly. They invited her into conversations instead of around them. Her notes were requested. Her observations cited. The patient lived. A family got more time. More mornings. More ordinary moments that now felt extraordinary. There was no dramatic speech. No standing ovation. Just a shared understanding. The nurse they had ignored had saved a life. And in doing so, she proved something more enduring than a single cure. That impossible is often just another word. For unexamined, Leah didn't ask for fame. She asked for patients to be seen. Mayo Clinic created a new protocol. Nurses were invited into research discussions. And Leah received a letter from a young girl. "I want to work in medicine too, but people say I won't matter." Leah framed that letter on her wall. Because genius doesn't wear one uniform. And miracles don't ask for permission.